Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Chavat Samuelson. I'm the Regents Professor of History and Irving and Miriam Lowe Professor of Modern Judaism, as well as Director of Jewish Studies at Arizona State University. If you've been with us before, you know that the Center for Jewish Studies at Arizona State is committed to disseminating knowledge about Jews and Judaism through guest lectures, research conferences, adult education courses, and historical exhibits. Since the beginning of the pandemic, we have offered a robust program in online public events, public lectures, covering many aspects of Jewish history, religion, and culture. In the previous semester, we held a research conference on Jewish-Muslim relations through the ages. We also had 3 lecture series, one on religion and science, one on thinking through literature after Auschwitz, and one on Jewish genealogy. And these lectures featured the ASU faculty as well as scholars from other universities. This semester, we started with the Eckstein Scholar in Residence when Professor Pamela Nadell from American University lectured on Jewish women and the feminist revolution. And we then launched the series that Professor Mirvis is doing on the rabbis that shaped Jewish history. The first lecture covered the rabbis of the Talmud. The second one covered rabbis of the Middle Ages. And this evening, his third and last lecture will focus on rabbis of the early modern period. I want to remind you that on Tuesday of this week, we actually started yet another lecture series, and I hope you could attend it. The series is on ancient roots, Judaism and ancient Christianity. On Tuesday this week, we heard from Professor Blake Hartung, who explored or explained how the Bible was formed, or how interpreting and making the Bible created 2 distinctive textual communities of Jews who read the text very differently. On this coming Tuesday, which is February 8th, we're going to listen to Françoise Mirguet, who is going to explain how the processes, those historical processes, actually led to the separation of those 2 communities, 2 textual communities, and the creation of what we know as Judaism and Christianity as 2 distinct religions. And on February 15th, we will study with Professor Timothy Langiel, who will explain how various ethnic, cultural, and religious categories created group identity, especially among Jews in Antiquity. All these lectures engage the Jewish civilization from historical perspective, expressing the conviction that understanding the Jewish past is necessary not only for Jewish life in the present and the future, but also to peaceful coexistence of Jews and non-Jews who live in multi-ethnic, multicultural, and multi-religious societies. Our programs are open to all, and I hope that you have found them informative and enriching. Let me turn off my camera and my microphone as we're going to listen to the lecture on the rabbis of the early modern period. At the end, as you all know, you can post your question in the Q&A function. Please do so in the Q&A rather than in the chat, and then we will engage Professor Mirvis. So, Professor Mirvis, the screen is yours.
Oh, thank you very much, Chava. You can already see, hopefully you can already see my PowerPoint, so that saved a little time. Just to remind us where we're coming from and where we're going, we have begun this discussion with the early period, with late antiquity, the period immediately following the destruction of the temple in 70 Common Era. And these have been our central questions, and I want to remind us of these questions just one last time, because I think tonight, as we talk about the early modern period, the period that stretches roughly from 1400 to 1800, we will see a lot of these questions becoming even more relevant and perhaps even claiming some answers, although I make no claim to having any real complete answers to these questions. Sometimes the questions are even more important. So question number 1 is, who is a rabbi? The issue of smicha. This will become very important when we're talking about the early modern period. Is there such a thing as ordination? Who qualifies as being a rabbi in the early modern period, especially in marginal areas like in the Americas? Is there a difference between some functionaries like the chazanim and like the cantors and the functionaries, the shochet, and a rabbi in a place where there are no rabbis. So these are some central questions. Question number 2, when is a rabbi? And I think we've already really unpacked that question a lot. Number 3, what is rabbinic authority? Is there such a thing as rabbinic authority? Does rabbinic authority require institutionalization? Does it require even political clout behind a rabbi in order to actually enforce a rabbi's ruling? As we've seen time and again in this class, rabbi sets a one standard for what Jewish activity should be or what Jewish behavior is, which is very often not in accord with what Jews actually do and who Jews are. So these are two kind of different realities. And what kind of authority do rabbis have to really enforce their vision of Jewish behavior? And the last one, number 4, what is rabbinic culture? Is there a kind of culture within a culture? Within Judaism, a separate manifestation of Jewish identity and Jewish expression that can be defined as rabbinic. Is it based in Hebrew writing? Is it based in the Talmud? Is it based on law codes, which we talked a lot about in the Middle Ages, and I'll remind us again tonight? Commentaries, the Parshanut, Responsa, Shelot Chuvot, preaching, and so on. And preaching, I'll just point to this, will be very important in the early modern period. So we began our discussion talking about late antiquity. We looked at the creation of a rabbinic class in the Galilee. We spent a lot of time talking about the rabbi, Yehuda HaNasi, who is credited with really the final editing of the Mishnah, which becomes the essential text of rabbinic decision-making, and how his authority was rooted in the office of the Nasi, which was backed by Roman imperial authority. And then we switched our focus to the Sasanian world. We looked at the Jews of Babylonia and a contemporary of Yehuda HaNasi, Shmuel of Nehardia, and looking at the creation of rabbinic authority in a different geographic sphere, and that the complicated relationship with the land of Israel, but also with an authority that was rooted in a kind of political intercession or having some kind of temporal authority behind the rabbinic authority. And then last time we began our discussion of the rabbis of the Middle Ages. We didn't talk about all rabbis in the Middle Ages, that would be impossible, but we did focus on certain groups, the Gaonim. We talked about their efforts in Baghdad as the academies of Papadita and Sura in the 9th century become centralized in Baghdad under the Abbasids. Their efforts to make the Talmud into a fixed text, their efforts to create a Jewish liturgy, their efforts to model themselves as the true voice of rabbinic authority, of the oral tradition. And we talked about the Ageret of Shira Gaon. We then focused in northern France, in the Rhineland, and talked about the Tosafists and their interactions with scholastics and dialectic methods that were being done by non-Jewish scholars at the time, their readings of the Talmud, and the way that they inserted themselves into the Talmud through their commentary, making the Talmud something relevant to life in Ashkenaz, reading Ashkenazic culture, be it martyrdom or be it an idea of a sanctified community that has its own traditions. That was inevitable. Figured this out now. And we looked at some of the ways that the Tosafists tried to reconcile daily life under Christendom within the Talmud. This is very important. I want to spend a couple of seconds just talking about this because we are going to return to the idea of legal codification in the early modern period. So in the Middle Ages, there's this effort to turn the Talmud into something that's usable for Jewish life. And it becomes a rabbinic mission and not one free of controversy, turning the Talmud translating it into something that could be used by Jews to define what the law might be and how to live their life halachically according to the Jewish law. The first effort was done by Isaac Alfasi, who basically took the Talmud, kept it in its Aramaic, but just took away the homiletical parts and took away the parts that were related to the temple. And then comes Maimonides, and Maimonides does something very radical. He reorganizes it, he puts it into Hebrew. He tells you don't need the Talmud anymore, just read this law code and read the Bible, and then you'll have the totality of the Jewish experience. And he doesn't give you your sources. So this is a really radical effort of codification of the law. And then in Ashkenaz, the Tosafists, they do something a little bit different. They codify law by organizing it differently according to positive or negative commandments and Moshe Mekutsi's Sefer Mitzvot Gadol. And then the most important is Yaakov ben Yechiel's Arba Turim, ben Asher ben Yechiel, the Arba Turim, which gave four categories of Jewish law and organized it in that way. And that's going to be the model going forward of how rabbis are going to codify and organize Jewish law. Okay, and we looked at some images, of course, some images that are suggestive of rabbinic culture. And then we looked at the reactionary 13th century, the backlash to the more progressive Aristotelian 12th century. And then we culminated in our discussion of Shlomo ibn Adret, who we decided was going to be the model of what rabbinic authority could be in the Middle Ages. And so we spent most of the time talking about the Rashba, Shlomo ibn Adret, and that's where we left off last time. So here we are to today's lecture. That's just the recap you get. You even get that in the TV show, so I think you should get it here too. And so part 3 are the rabbis of early modernity. Now, early modernity, again, is the period that is relatively new in the way we think about history. It used to be that there was a very long Middle Ages, that the Roman Empire fell in the 5th century, and all of a sudden the French Revolution happened in 1789, and then the Middle Ages ended and modernity began, right? And so there was this huge Middle Ages. And over the past century, really, historians have pecked away at that, the way that we've seen that, have made a much more nuanced reading, that there are different eras within the Middle Ages. And then there's this period that is in between the High Middle Ages and the modern era that we call early modernity. And what makes it early modern is a couple things. One, there is continuity and change happening at the same time. So in the early modern period, there are features that look really kind of medieval, but there are also features that look kind of modern, all kind of coexisting at the same time. Another thing is that there are certain features of cultural identity and cultural life that are exclusive to the early modern period. Certain hybridities that really only exist in the early modern period, let's say, like witchcraft and practical mysticism, those kind of things are not really found in the Middle Ages so much, and they're not really a product of modernity so much, but in the early modern period, they're very profound and really central. So those are the kind of examples. Are living a life as a converso in Spain. That's a kind of converso crypto religion, is something that's very specific to the early modern period. It's neither Jewish, nor is it really Catholic. It's really its own kind of thing. And so these are the things that define early modernity. But for the Jews especially, early modernity is very profound, because there's a huge population shift that marks the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of early modernity. In the Middle Ages, most Jews are still concentrated in Babylonia, in Iraq. But the largest community of Jews outside of Iraq is in Spain. And in 1492, in a culmination of a series of expulsions in Western Europe, 150,000 to 200,000 Jews are uprooted. And that brings an end to one of the largest and most productive communities of the Middle Ages. And Spanish Jewry, the Sephardim, are going to be dispersed to new centers of location. So North Africa especially, about 20,000 go to North Africa. They often make their way onto the Ottoman Empire, which becomes another major location of Jewish settlement. Although there is, of course, an indigenous Jewish Greek-speaking Jewish community living there. And most of the people that left Spain went to Portugal, which will ultimately create another diaspora in the Western world, the Portuguese diaspora. So we'll talk a lot about those two diasporas today. But so that's one big population transference. But another one is in Ashkenaz. In the Middle Ages, Jews of Ashkenaz are really isolated to the Rhineland and then later to northern France and to Provence. But of course, as we said last time, Provence is very complicated. It's a border region between Aragon and Provence. So it's also very Spanish. And after the Black Death, there are a series of expulsions from German lands. And so German Jewry or Ashkenazic Jewry are really displaced either to Italy. So Italy is getting as a perfect storm of Jewish migration because Jews are expelled from southern Italy during the Spanish expulsion and they go north, and they're expelled from German lands. So they go south, and they're really kind of coalescing in places like Venice and Ferrara and places that are constructed really as Jewish settlements like Livorno. And alternatively, Ashkenazi Jewry is being relocated to Poland, Lithuania, where there are favorable economic policies wherein Jews could lease large estates and really have a pretty free development. And so this is why Polish Jewry, Ashkenazi Jewry today is often considered Polish or Lithuanian, and they speak a language that's Germanic, even though they're living in Poland, Lithuania, because they had been expelled from German lands. So this really, I think, the early modern period is much more clearly defined for Jews than even for other people because of these population displacements. Okay, so let's talk about rabbis, which is what we're here to do. So we mentioned before that one of the main locations of Sephardi migration was to the Ottoman Empire. Now, it wasn't a straight shot. Nobody really goes from Spain directly during the expulsion and goes directly to the Ottoman Empire. That's a bit of a mythology that's created by chroniclers at the time, who really wanted to create that mythology that the Ottomans just welcomed the Jews in. But really, it was a much more complex migratory pattern. But eventually, you start to see Jewish settlements in the Ottoman Empire, and places like Salonika and Istanbul become megatropolises of Jewish settlement. But Jews also like to settle in places that aren't very valuable to the Ottomans, like Sfat in the Galilee, because it was a location where ancient rabbis, the Tanaim rabbis of Judah HaLevi, Yehuda HaNasi's kind of vintage, are buried around the area. So very important for Jews, but held no real significance to the Ottomans. This is why sometimes the Ottomans will displace people. In a Sirgun system, they'll uproot Jews who want to live in Sfat and send them to Rhodes, which is more economically valuable. But you can understand why Jews would want to settle in places like Sfat or Tiberias, places that had this connection to the Galilean rabbinic class that we had first introduced our course with. And this is all happening at the same time as the birth of a new form of mysticism. And Chava is much more qualified to speak about the particulars of this type of mysticism. But in essence, this is a mysticism that's known as Lurianic Kabbalah. And what it does differently than earlier medieval forms of mysticism is, and this is a very reductionist way of looking at it, but it marries the theosophical elements of Kabbalah, that is the nature of God and God's relationship to creation, with an idea of redemption, of Messiah. And by doing that, it kind of creates a more populist form of mysticism, where all Jews really have a role to play in bringing about the messianic redemption. And it also introduced new forms of cosmology, so new theories about how the world was created and what are the imperfections of creation that need to be reconciled by the Jewish people and their intentions as they perform commandments. This is I'd say the broad stroke essence of Lurianic Kabbalah. And so this dramatically is going to impact the early modern rabbinate in multiple ways. So one of the most immediate ways, you see someone like Yaakov Berav, who is of the generation of the expulsion, who was born in Spain as a Jew, left Spain as a Jew, comes to the Ottoman Empire, settles there, and establishes rabbinic authority in Safat, in this place that has all this mystical meaning, but no real economic value to the Ottomans. And he tries to reestablish smicha. Now, why is he reestablishing it? We talked a lot about smicha in our very first class, because it was clear that Yehuda HaNasi in the 3rd century believed that only the Nasi, only the patriarch, which was an office created by the Romans, right? That only the Nasi had the power to grant the ordination of rabbis. And that had to be done in the Holy Land, in the land of Israel. Only the land of Israel has the power to grant the authority of a rabbi. And this was front and center in that discourse when Shmuel of Nehardia came to visit Yehuda HaNasi and refused to accept ordination because of the power of the land of Israel and receiving ordination. Now, to make things more complex, the office of the patriarch was not renewed by the Romans in the 5th century. So I think in the 470s, the last Nasi dies, Gamaliel VI, and the Romans don't renew that office. So really, is there any such thing as smicha from during the Middle Ages? And this is a very debatable thing. There are definitely people like someone like Ibn Adret, who we talked about before, who refer to themselves as rabbis. The kings of Spain refer to rabbis. They report to Rabbi. They will put a Rab de la Corte in a community using the terminology of rabbi. So the terminology exists. There's the Av Beit Din, there are Chachamim, there are numerous ways of defining rabbis. But is there such a thing as smicha? Well, according to Yaakov Berav, there was not, and is tied up in the messianic mission of Luriana Kabbalah, and also of, it's a little bit early for really the maturity of Luriana Kabbalah, but tied up to the messianic connection with the expulsion from Spain is the idea of reestablishing smicha now that we've resettled in the land of Israel. Now, this was a controversial effort. He does manage to offer ordination to some people like Yosef Karo, another Sephardi Jew. But the rabbinate in Jerusalem rejects this attempt, and there's a very interesting exchange of letters between the rabbis of Jerusalem and Yaakov Berav, where they disagree on whether or not smicha can legitimately be reestablished. But the early modern period brought new meaning for the rabbinic culture and rabbinic authority. Now, this culminates in a lot of ways in Yosef Karo's Shulchan Aruch. This is why I wanted to go through that codification again, because Yosef Karo, who is a mystic, he's a mystic in every stripe there is. He has a madid. There is a heavenly agent that speaks to him divine secrets. So he has access to all kinds of mystical knowledge beyond what's available through the Talmud. But he also believes in codifying the Jewish law in the most simple and accessible way possible as a messianic redemptive project. The better the Jews can access the right way of performing the law, the more rich their efforts to repair the world will be for a final messianic redemption. So it's interesting. This is a very early modern thing. The idea of Jewish law being bound together with messianism or bound together with mysticism is quite an early modern way of thinking of the world. And Yosef Karo is a very good example of that. The Shulchan Aruch is published in 1565, and very immediately the Polish rabbinate under Moshe Isserles, the Ramah, who's a figure that we really could have spent a lot more time talking about, offered his own Ashkenazi glosses on the way that the law is to be practiced, but not all Ashkenazim accepted that. So Solomon Luria in Germany rejected that was even the Ashkenazi practice. So there's not really a sense here of being part of a Jewish people, that there is a one law that defines what all Jews do. There's still a lot of particularities, which raises the questions of how successful the Gaonim really were in establishing the fixity of the Talmud. Okay, so now going forward, now that we've set that up, going forward, I actually want to spend more time talking about specific individuals, people that I think best embody early modernity and what it means to be a rabbi in the early modern period. And we can't do that without talking about this amazing person, Leone Modena, who many of you I'm sure have heard of. He's quite possibly the most famous rabbi who ever lived. And I think that's probably a pretty fair statement. Maybe Maimonides, I guess, but I don't know. Leone Modena is a pretty close second, at least in my mind. But he was a deeply integrated person into the Counter-Reformation era Italian world that he lived in. Whoops. I don't know if you can see this. Yeah, so he was a translator of Italian literature. He translated Ariosto's Orlando Furioso, so classic vernacular Renaissance humanistic literature. He found to be compelling enough to put into the Hebrew language. He was a patron to the famous composer Salomone de Rossi. He encouraged Salomone de Rossi to write Baroque music. And by the way, this is a very good moment to give another plug, because Jewish studies, I believe in the coming months, we're going to be having a program focused only on Italian Baroque Jewish music. And so, put that in your calendars too, because that's coming up soon. And that's going to be really interesting and informative. But this was something that Leone Modena could get behind and supported. But like all other rabbis, we saw that Shlomo ibn Adret was almost obsessively connected to the court of Hayim II in Aragon. Yehuda Nasi had been connected with the imperial rule of Caracalla. Shmuel of Neradia in Babylonia connected to the rule of Shapur I. So, one of the things, I think the themes that have come out here is that rabbis are almost always connected to some kind of temporal authority. Leone Modena is no exception. He was very much connected to the court of Maria de Medici and Henry IV in France. He composed dozens of panegyric poems for them when they got married, when they had their first child. He was there with a poem to praise them. And he wrote multiple essays on the art of preaching, right, using the kind of Renaissance era interest in rhetoric. And he was a preacher to non-Jews, right? A lot of non-Jews and dignitaries would come to hear him preach in the Venetian ghetto and in other ghettos. And that's another really important point about Leone Modena in the era of ghettos in Italy. But he was a very halakhically progressive guy. And this is an interesting aspect of his life. It got him in trouble, of course, with a lot of other rabbis. But for instance, you find in his Shelot Chuvot issues over how he refused to cover his head. You can see that in this image here. His defense was that when asked why won't he cover his head, he said, well, in Italy, when you see a cleric walking by, you've got to doff your cap to the cleric. And if you're not wearing a cap, then you have nothing to doff to the cleric. So that was his defense. But he seemed to, and this is another issue that comes up with other rabbis too. You see Elijah of Vilna also defending not wearing head covering. And so it's not as controversial as you might think it is. But also things like playing tennis and sea travel on Sabbath. He made a lot of allowances for this. And according to his he wrote an autobiography. It seemed like he had no qualms eating, or rather, I should say, drinking wine, yayin nesach, the wine of non-Jews. Now, if you go back to the late Tosafists, we talked a lot about this last time, and the idea of shituf and the idea of umot gederot, that really Christians don't qualify as the ovdei avodah zorah, they don't qualify as the idolaters that the Talmud is talking about. Then really, if you follow like the Meiri to his full conclusion, you might have thought that he also would have allowed drinking the wine of non-Jews because they're not idolaters. And there's nothing other than idolatry that could invalidate the consumption of wine. Well, Leone Modena seemed to have no problem drinking plenty of wine with non-Jews. He also wrote very interesting defenses of rabbinic tradition. So one thing I think we could say that what makes a rabbi is they defend rabbis, right? A rabbi is someone who speaks for the authority of rabbis to be the voice of the oral tradition, to be the voice of Talmudic law. And he is no exception, but he does it in a very interesting way. So when he gets wind of the great heretic Uriel de Costa from Hamburg, who, while in Hamburg, writes these challenges to the Pharisaic tradition, you see Leone Modena writing in response to that a defense of the rabbinic tradition, the Shagat Aryeh, the lion's growl, and but he also writes an accompanying text to that called the Kol Sacha, the voice of the fool, which is a greater heretical book than even what Uriel de Costa had written. So he provided you a counterpoint of heresy and how to refute heretics. So, and, Talia Fishman and others have wondered, what was his real view, Leone Modena. And that's another thing. Rabbis sometimes tend to side on the error of err on the side of heresy from time to time. So he also wrote a response to non-Jewish Hebraist polemics or ethnographic polemics, as one historian has called them. And that is something like Buxtorf's, Johann Buxtorf's Synagoga Judaica, which was an ethnography of Jews, what Jews do. But it portrayed Jews as being really superstitious, backwards, and kind of weird. And, it really paid a lot of attention to the kaparot, how Jews like tortured chickens before Yom Kippur. And it really just portrayed Jews as being this really superstitious and backwards people, almost atavistic in their practice. And so Leone Modena wrote a response to that called the Riti Hebraici, in Italian, that was a counter ethnography of Jews. Here's what Jews actually do. But it was very sanitized of any kind of superstition or mysticism. So his Judaism was a very rational Judaism. Something of might be like something like what you might see in a Reform kind of a context today, where Judaism is very free of these kinds of magical and mysterious elements. Okay, and he very much disliked the new trends in mysticism, and he wrote a scathing critique of mysticism in his time to Ari Nohem, the Lion's Roar, Lion's Growl. I guess all of his books are called Lions because that's his name. And he also wrote an autobiography. And the autobiography is an amazing document. And if you haven't read it, it's been translated by Mark Cohen. And it's just an astounding document because, first of all, it's just a deeply early modern thing. The idea of writing an autobiography that starts in childhood, he does it before Rousseau's Confessions. And so he's almost like a real trendsetter in the idea of writing autobiographies, and other rabbis will follow suit. Yaakov Emden writes one. A little bit more subdued in the 18th century, Sefer Megillah. But in his autobiography, you get a really kind of a very candid portrayal of his life as someone who had traumas, hardships, who he lost, someone who wrestled with demons, gambling problems, and would constantly be putting himself into debt by gambling. And you also get a great sense of like the porousness of the boundaries of the ghetto walls. You have these ghettos up here, but he travels everywhere. He's a traveling preacher. He goes from community to community. And you get the sense that really, the ghettos are one thing, but there's a lot of fluidity in Jewish life, as evidenced by the autobiography of Leone Modena. And he's a very early modern man. He hates Kabbalah. He hates mysticism. He writes the scathing text against it, Ari Nohem. But at the same time, when you read his autobiography, he's doing dream divination. He's an alchemist, right? So these things could kind of coexist in the early modern period. And really makes him like the great model of rabbinics in the early modern period. And his student, by the way, who's Charles Levi Mortiera, ends up traveling to Amsterdam, and there Charles Levi Mortiera will serve a community of Jews that are re-Judaizing, Jews that are leaving Iberian Peninsula and transitioning into a Jewish identity and all of that means. And one of those people that made that transition was Menachem Israel, who was born a converso in Portugal. Around age 12, he's in Amsterdam and he's learning in the academy, the Eitz Chaim Academy, an academy that's very focused on the mission of re-Judaizing, re-educating the Marranos, as one historian calls it, Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi. And he was a man with a lot of proficiency in non-Jewish literature and languages, and that's going to really define his career. So what makes Menachem Israel incredible is his printing. He is a prolific printer in Amsterdam, and he prints text as a contractor for the Queen of Sweden, Queen Christina, the daughter of Gustavus Adolphus, who was someone with Hagia Sophia, like someone who loved literature and loved learning, and a patron of knowledge, and so he obviously wrote hundreds of panegyric poems and other things for Queen Christina. He would, like Leone Modena, deliver sermons for dignitaries in the synagogue and the Asnoha in Amsterdam. And so he's often kind of called the rabbi for the Gentiles, because not only is he delivering sermons in vernacular languages to non-Jewish dignitaries, but he's also getting in theological debates with them and even writing texts that seem to have nothing to do with Judaism, like, for instance, a Spanish text, De Fragilidad Humana in 1642, which is a text about predestination, which seems to be weighing in on an internal Protestant dispute in that's specific to Calvinists in Holland, right? So really nothing to do with Jewish context at all. Now, you can imagine other rabbis in the community did not like him for this. Charles Levi Mortiera, his position was, we do not talk to non-Jews. We do not get involved in their debates. Charles Levi Mortiera seemed to have hated Menachem Israel. This is all evidenced by the fact that he kept on getting knocked down in pay grade. And Charles Levi Mortiera kept on getting paid more and more, and Menachem Israel less and less. But Menachem Israel also had a rivalry with Yitzchak Abu Abdei Fonseca, who was his contemporary and fellow student in the Academy of Eitz Chaim Yeshiva. And so that rivalry is also going to kind of define the rabbinate in Amsterdam. But this is a guy who's getting paid a salary by a community. So as close to a modern rabbi we've gotten so far. You know, Shlomo Ibn Adret was not being paid a salary by the community, by the Kihila. He was the head of an academy in Barcelona, which is a little different. Now you're starting to see a rabbi as we think of rabbis, like people who are being paid salaries by communities. And one of his most incredible exploits is his role in the readmission of Jews into England. So a political player. He wrote to Cromwell. In fact, Cromwell put him up in a hotel, and Cromwell paid for his burial. He was dead broke when he died because he was kind of hated, and he had squandered all of this wealth trying to convince Whitehall to let Jews in, but they never did. And ultimately, it took the Restoration period to allow Jews back into England, even though they had the support of Oliver Cromwell. But here's a guy also in connection with some of the great leaders of Western Europe at the time, and I think that this is a common theme about rabbis in the pre-modern era. So here is a portrait. This portrait is made by Salome Italia, which is a clear, definite portrait of Menachem Israel. This one we assume is a portrait of Menachem Israel, because who else could it be? But this was painted by Rembrandt. And it's clearly Menachem Israel had a connection with Rembrandt, and this is a very safe assumption that that's who this is. Okay, we have so much to do here, and I'm really running out of time, but let's just go through this really quickly. Sabbatianism, the belief in the false prophet or the failed prophet, Shabtai Tzvi and his messianic claim that kind of went belly up in 1666 when he converted to Islam. Thing is, a lot of rabbis in Europe, if not most of the rabbis, signed on to the belief in Shabtai Tzvi. Now, so someone like you see here on the far right, Shlomo Ayalon, was a devoted, committed Sabbatian. Someone like Yitzhak Abloh de Fonseca was a little bit more lukewarm. He was a committed Sabbatian, but when Shabtai Tzvi converted to Islam, he gave up on that. So you see different rabbinic positions on the messiahship of Shabtai Tzvi in 1666. And then this man in the middle, Yaakov Sisportis, was the most angrily and vociferously aggressive voice against Sabbatianism and collected a lot of the letters that were circulating among rabbis about the issue called Tzitzat Novel Tzvi, the flowering deer. Okay, I wanted to show some pictures of the London Rabbinate because they kind of have a look to them, and you can really see the deep integration of rabbinic culture with a kind of Protestant posture of how clergy might look. And so I think that this, when you look at now, each one of these figures in his own way was fighting against reforms. They were deeply traditional, even though they were all kind of embedded in sciences, especially David Nieto. But what you see here are also kind of really adopting the trends of what clergy look like, and you can start to see a transition from rabbinate to clergy. And I think that's good. That's really what's going to define the modern period. I really could spend the whole time talking about these guys. They're my favorites. You know, these are emissaries from the Holy Land, from the Ottoman Holy Land. They are rabbis, and they circulate the world. Karigal, who you see on the left here, ends up in Jamaica. He ends up in Suriname. He dies in Barbados, and he delivers a sermon in Newport. So these guys are everywhere. There's about 14 other shlichim, or these emissaries that show up in America, and probably the greatest of them is Hayim Yosef David Azulai, who never makes it to America, but travels throughout North Africa, Italy, Germany, England, France, and he wrote a travelogue about it, the Magal Tov. And it's just an incredible capturing of daily life, but also of the role of a rabbi. As an emissary, the rabbis could really interject into intercommunal disputes because they were outsiders. They had rabbinic knowledge, and they had the bona fides of the Holy Land behind them. So they are some of the most powerful rabbinic voices in the early modern period. And quickly, the thing that, at least according to Gershom Scholem, destroys all the rabbinate is Sabbatianism. So, the belief in the false prophet of Shabtai Tzvi, according to Gershom Scholem, was the thing that really weakened the rabbinate, that allowed the Enlightenment and then ultimately the Reform movement to kind of spearhead modernity for the Jewish people. So Gershom Scholem, the theorist, really believes that Sabbatianism is key to understanding Jewish modernity. And there's a lot of truth to this argument, although there's a lot of flaws too. But one of the key elements here is how the rabbinate could kind of self-destruct over the issue of Sabbatianism. So this is not a picture of Yaakov Emden, by the way. That's his father, the Tzvi Hirsch Ashkenazi. But you guys already knew that. You're all saying to yourself, that is not Jacob Emden. And that's because Jacob Emden doesn't have a portrait, as far as I know. But basically, when you have a really popular rabbi, like Yonatan Ibis, who's a rabbi in Prague, one of the biggest, most prosperous Jewish communities in Europe, who ends up in Altona, and where Jacob Emden, who's kind of disaffected from the rabbinate, finds out that this guy Ibis, who's deeply popular, beloved all throughout Europe, was writing kamayot, writing amulets that were absolutely unequivocally Sabbatian. They were alluding to the messianic redemption of Shabtai Tzvi, and Yaakov Emden called him out as being a false prophet, as being a heretic, and it divided the rabbinate so viscerally that it really led to a deep schism, a schism that had resonance in the German press at the time. So non-Jews were kind of seeing how Jews were fighting here in the Emden and Ibis affair. Emden had his supporters, Ibis had his supporters, And ultimately some governments got involved. The king of Denmark, which was then ruling over Altona at the time, had been invited to interfere in this internally Jewish dispute. But here you see this kind of self-destruction of the rabbinate towards the end of the early modern period, and a critical moment in Jewish history. The Emden Ibis affair is just a very key historical moment. By the way, I think a lot of it has to do with personality. Yonatan Ibishitz was very nice. He was nice, he was soft-spoken, he was brilliant, he was beloved by his students. And Emden he had a printing press in his house and was just hated by everybody, called everybody a heretic. He saw Sabbatianism everywhere he looked. And he just had a very different temperament. And I think a lot of this had to do with temperament. Okay, here's where I want to end. If you could just give me 4 more minutes, because I think this guy, the Noda Yehuda, the known in Judah, Ezekiel Orlando, it represents the culmination of every theme that we've been talking about here, and especially in the early modern period. He is the point that in which all these threads kind of intersect, where the early modernity comes to an end and modernity begins, all with Ezekiel Orlando. And so I think his importance in this discussion is critical. He is ultimately the what all of our discussion of rabbis has been leading up to, I think. So he was the principal rabbi of Prague between 1755 and 1793, so a very long time, and it gave him a lot of clout in the Jewish world. But he, like every other rabbi we've seen, was deeply political and deeply invested in secular regimes. He, especially during the 7 Years' War, he offered prayers in support of the Austrian Habsburg military. He threatened anybody that supported the Prussian enemies in the 7 Years' War with a harem. And that had been a real issue because a couple of years earlier, Jews had supported the Prussians, and it led to their limited expulsion under the mother of the current Austrian Emperor, Maria Theresa. So he had a lot of reasons to really to control Jewish patriotism in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And in the 1760s, he starts to fight a new trend, secularism. Nothing to do with the Enlightenment, no Haskalah, no reform movement, nothing, but just Jews are just naturally going to theaters, they're going to taverns, going to coffee houses, they're shaving their beards, and they're doing things that just seems that are outside the confines of Jewishness, and there's no real intellectual component to it. It's just a human component. So you start to see a rabbi from the pulpit really yelling against the trends of secularism in the 1760s with Ezekiel Orlando. He takes a conciliatory approach in the Emden Ibis affair. He was a good friend of Ibis, and he really saw Ibis' genius. But look, he got some of the kameot, and he said, you can't the amulets. And he said, look, these amulets are unequivocally Sabbatianism. So he called on Yonatan Ibis to condemn the amulets and thereby save his reputation. So that's a really conciliatory approach, I think, to the Emden Ibis controversy. And he's at the intersection of a new movement that's going to really spawn Jewish modernity as well, and that is Hasidut. So before he was the rabbi of Prague, he was part of the Kreutz of Brody, which was a kind of academy that was really focused on the study of theosophical Kabbalah. That they lived very ascetic lifestyles. They mastered the text of the Kabbalah, and they would, live. They would eat very little. They would stay up all night long. They lived very regimented and disciplined lives in the pursuit of Kabbalistic knowledge. These people are sometimes called the old style Hasidim to differentiate them from the new Beshti Hasidim, the Hasidim that we think of as Hasidim. So because he was part of this Brody Kreutz and part of the old school of mysticism, he was vehemently against the new Hasidut that was emerging around Poland. And he spoke very adamantly against them. And he called them upstarts. He believed that they did not master the Kabbalah, and they have no right to call themselves mystics if they don't study rigorously disciplined study of Kabbalah like he did. so he stands at the crossroads of this great movement. But just as much as he rejected Hasidut, he very much rejected Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment. He was adamantly opposed to Moses Mendelssohn's project to translate the Bible into German, the Bior project, and he spoke very candidly about that. But so you can see this is an agent of tradition, a man steeped in tradition. He doesn't even like the Hasidim. He definitely doesn't like the Haskalah. But here's his amazing elements that make him an early modern rabbi. He stood at the crossroads of changes that he had no control over. And he was deeply connected to the Emperor Joseph II. In 1781, Joseph II issued the beginning of what would be a series of edicts that compelled the Jews to integrate better into Austrian society by learning German, requiring them to go to school, later on requiring them in 1783 to get civil marriages. So this is another great theme of the early modern period, the gradual erosion of the autonomy of the Kehillah, and he was seeing it before his own eyes. So on the one hand, he yelled at Jews like Naphtali Hertz Vesely, who were excited about this, who believed that Joseph I was doing them some great favor. He was adamantly against that. But on the other hand, he knew that if he didn't imprint the changing world, then it would change without him. And so he establishes the normal shul in 1782. So, okay, Jews are now mandated to learn German. They have to have secular education. He's going to be the one that establishes the school to make sure that the Torah education that they're getting is going to be of the same quality. So rather than being a roadblock to change, he wants to fashion the change and make sure that it's within his own image. And I'll leave us with this great moment. In 1782, Ezekiel Orlando, now quite an elder, statesman, one of the great rabbis who had ever lived, is there ahead of all the Jewish conscripts that have been taken into the imperial army of the Austro-Hungarian army. And he is standing before them. And you could see if this was a man opposed to change, he just wouldn't have been involved at all. He knew that being part of the imperial army would mean sacrifices and Sabbath observance, would mean sacrifices in kashrut and dietary restrictions. But instead of opposing these changes, he shaped the changes. And he delivers a sermon where he compels them to not forget their identities, to stay true to their Jewishness, no matter what happens. And he also hands out Teletot and Tefillin. He hands out the phylacteries and the prayer shawls to all the soldiers. So one of the first social facing rabbinic movements. And with this gesture, I believe that's the beginning of the modern rabbinate. So thank you for indulging me going a little over time. And thank you for joining me for these past 3 lectures. They've been a lot of fun for me. And I'm curious to see what you have to say.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Stanley. This was very enlightening indeed. Kind of you brought us the, how shall we say, the fluidity or the relationship between change and tradition. So we have both going at the same time, and therefore this period is rather difficult to grasp. I would like to, by way of starting our conversation and our discussion, I would like to ask you if you could comment on the attitude of the rabbinate in this early modern period towards science, and speak maybe particularly about the Maharal of Prague and how he fits into the story and what kind of leap toward modernity the Maharal created.
Yeah, that's a great question because, it's a very complicated relationship to science. And I would also like to bring in Isserles to the discussion as well. And what Maharal of Prague and Moshe Isserles in Krakow have in common is the same student, David Gans, who becomes like a real Jewish, one of the first Jews to really engage the trends of the scientific revolution. And something of a backwards way, but nonetheless, he has discourse with Tycho Brahe and others in the court of Rudolf II in Bohemia. So starting with Isserles, you see a rabbi, Moshe Isserles, who wrote those glosses on the Shulchan Aruch, a rabbi, one of the most important rabbis in Poland, Lithuania, who did have a limited embrace of astronomy. He was very interested in astronomy because, you look, without real astronomy, a lot of Jewish life can't take place. All right, the calendar is of absolute importance in Jewish life, and without proper astronomy, there is no proper calendar. And that's just one of the examples of why proper astronomy is critical to Jewish life. So Isserles was very interested in astronomy, but he really didn't venture beyond the texts of the Middle Ages. So he cites like Avram Bar Chia all the time. He looks to the Jews of the Islamic world that were engaging in astronomical ventures too, in an Aristotelian sense. So very, very limited in his scope, but still open to embracing astronomy. And he encourages his student David Gans, who had come from Western Europe, from Westphalia, to go study with Isserles in Krakow, encourages him to take the study of astronomy further. And then that's when David Gans takes his leave and he goes to Prague, and there he studies with the great Maharal, Yehuda ben Betzalel Low in Prague, who is one of the great commentators on Galut, on like the condition of being a diaspora, right, is kind of the main thrust of his trend. And there was an argument. God, who was it? I think it's actually Ruderman, who makes the case that David Ruderman, I think, argues that Maharal had an interest in science, but in a very different way than Isserles, whereas Isserles saw the two as possibly being integrated. The Maharal of Prague saw them as completely different spheres, right? There is the world of Kabbalah, especially, where it's just critical to the Maharal as an absolute truth. There's revelation, that's an absolute truth. And then there's science, which could also be an absolute truth, the astronomical observations. And the Maharal of Prague did have interactions with great astronomers of the scientific revolution himself. And he encouraged David Gans to take it further. So David Gans went on to write Nichman V'Naim, right? This great text of astronomy. Now, it's not that great because ultimately he rejects the Copernican theory because it's not consistent with the biblical narrative. So it's a little bit of the scientific revolution is not a linear process. It's back and forth. But the fact that the Maharal of Prague was open to that, and the fact that the Maharal of Prague could also see science as a kind of perfect knowledge of itself, but one that stood completely separate from the world of the Torah and the Kabbalah. I mean, that's how I understand it. But I mean, what do you think?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that what the Maharal does is create a hierarchical relationship between science and faith. So science pertains to the physical world, but that's not where Jews really belong. According to the Maharal, Jews really belong to the supernatural world, not to the natural world. So therefore, you can accept science because science ultimately is about the less important stuff. And the Jews really live beyond the scientific world. And in that sense, you can be open to it, but that's not where the real action is. The real action is in the world of Torah. So you can be open to science, but also at the same time create a move science one notch down, even though that's not what's going to happen years later when science really has the upper hand as far as the path to truth, but not for the Maharal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that sounds interesting. That's interesting. I would argue, and see if you agree with this, is that, after the 16th century, like after the generation of the Maharal and the Ramah and Krakow, that interest in science, kind of ebbs away from the rabbinate, and it becomes more of it starts to be consumed by the early Enlightenment figures, which I would say are kind of anti-rabbinic. And so someone like Raphael Levi Hanover and these early Maskilim, they start to be interested in Ardel Medigo is a good example. Yashar, Yosef Shlomo de Medigo, not a rabbi, right, by any stretch of the imagination, right? He's studying in Padua, he's traveling around, but on the other hand, Menachem Israel publishes the Sefer Elim, publishes his book of science in Amsterdam. So maybe there's where the intersection is. But I would say after that early generation, there might be a little bit of a disconnect between the rabbinate and the way that science, interest in science, evolves among Jews.
Mm-hmm. All right, you've got a lot of questions waiting for you in the Q&A. So why don't you?
I know I probably raced through this a lot because I when I looked at my time clock here, my timer, I saw that it was 20 minutes, and I hadn't even gone through half of the first slide. So I gotta turn the engine into second gear. So the question is, did Leone drink stam yenam and or definitive yain nesach? We have the censored response of the Ramah, who allowed the Moravian Jews to continue such practices for That's a really good question. I don't know that, because the best that I know, I think that our knowledge of Leone Modena's wine drinking comes from his autobiography. And there he's just hanging out with non-Jews, gambling with them. And when you gamble with non-Jews, like, when you go to Las Vegas, you're going to drink with them. And so that's what Leone Modena was doing. He was, but I guess that the distinction here that you're making is wine that's been sanctified and wine that hasn't. And so, yeah, he might not have done that. But look, if you take, like I said before, if you take the conclusions of some of the late Tosafists that Christians don't apply to the category of akum, of the kochavim, the mazalot, the idolaters, then, if they're not idolaters, then there is no sanctified wine, right? So I'm not sure exactly, but he was drinking wine with non-Jews, is for sure, and drinking their wine. He wasn't bringing his own wine. Okay, and then Sharon thanks Lisa, and I want to join Sharon and also thanking Lisa, of course. Okay, now David, with the growing efforts to codify Talmudic law to guide the people, might it be said that the Rabbinic Authority grew as the people became less and less informed, for whatever the reason, as the Torah? The gap between the knowledge of the Jewish masses and a select few might help explain in part the growth of Rabbinic Authority, much like in our time. I think that's a brilliant thing that you're saying. I think Spinoza would be proud of you for saying it, because I think that's what you just said there is I think what Spinoza would say about the rabbinate, that they use religion as a way to control people. And the less connected they are to the law themselves, then the easier it is for rabbis to manipulate people. I mean, that's a pretty cynical way of looking at the world. Spinoza was a lot of things, and he was also a cynic for sure. But so I think Spinoza would agree with you. But look, you have someone like Uriel de Costa who's coming at this from a whole different perspective. When he comes to Amsterdam, he, at least seemingly, doesn't understand the rabbinic tradition, because at least this is the argument made by Isaac Heva, is that Uriel de Costa, who grew up as a converso, only had access to the Old Testament. And then he shows up in Amsterdam, and all these rabbis are telling him that Judaism is this and Judaism is that, and you can't do this on Sabbath, and you can't do that. And and then Uriel de Costa is like, "What are you talking about? This is not what I understood Judaism to be." And that gave rise to a kind of skepticism that ultimately produced Spinoza. So, I think that the idea of rejecting rabbinic tradition is very much connected to what you're asking here. There is a decisive early modern movement to reject rabbinic authority. Something I forgot to mention about the early Kabbalah, right? Kabbalah creates dissent within the rabbinate. It gives power to people who aren't rabbis to have an alternative authority that can be subversive in a lot of ways. The concerns over Lutzato, the Ramchal. Like, here's a guy who's seemingly saying that, like, he got a new Zohar, right? So if he got a new Zohar, like, who's to say that his Magid in heaven isn't going to tell him a new Torah? And he can say, well, the rabbis in the Talmud say this, but I heard in my heavenly discussions a whole new Torah. And you could see why why Kabbalah and skepticism are equally subversive to the rabbinic tradition. So I think that that's all connected to what you're asking. And then Carol asked, where do the pictures of the rabbis come from? So great question. I get them from all over, but a lot of those are from like where I actually took the digital images. JTS has a great collection of rabbinic portraits. You can just go to digital collections at JTS and you can see them there. But most of the rabbi pictures that you saw there were front pieces of their book. So, just like today, they put like a picture of, thankfully they didn't do that in my book. Like, they put a picture of the author in the back of your book. So they did that too. And when they printed it in the early modern period. And so they're front pieces that show you what the author looks like. That's where most of those images are from. Now, another question, I was wondering about the consensus. There was one among the rabbis about the Frankists offshoot, the Sabbatians. Yeah, the condemnation of the Talmud surely condemned, but I would like to know more about the response to the graces. Yeah, so bottom line, rabbis don't like Frankists, for sure. In fact, the Frankists got really dangerous because the Frankists end up accusing the Jews of blood libel, of saying that like we were once Jews. So Frankists were Sabbatians in Podolia, in a part of Poland that had a very robust belief in Shabtai Tzvi, and but they really are offshoot not of Sabbatianism per se, but of the Don Me. So from a complicated lineage, Jacob Frank was the reincarnation of Brachio Russo, who was the reincarnation of Shabtai Tzvi at some point. So that's what the Frankists are. And then they practice all kinds of antinomian things, like they have sexual hospitality, and they completely reject the law, that the law is binding, and then I think in 1759 or something, they convert in mass to Catholicism, and no small feat, like thousands of them. Not a small thing, like there are thousands of converts to Catholicism, and then they change their tune. They go to the Polish bishops and they say, you know what, that blood libel thing, we were once Jews, and I'll tell you, the Jews actually do that. So Frankists were super dangerous, and rabbis hated them. But look, Ariel, to make your question more complex. So I think that his name is Falk. There was a rabbi called Falk in Poland, who was one of the rabbis that was employed by the Vad Arba Artsot. And he, I think, was the greatest voice, like calling for censorship of the Frankists. I could be wrong about this. There's a great new book, the Erev Rav, by Pavel Mashieshko, about the Frankists. So if you want more information, but to make it more complicated, Yonatan Ibis, one of the great rabbis of Europe in the 18th century, his son Wolf Ibis became an ardent Frankist, a crazy one. So had this huge mansion I think in Altona, and he had orgies and all kinds of strange stuff going on in there. So sometimes there wasn't even that much of a separation between who's a rabbi, and he was a rabbi's son, but and who is a Frankist. So, but yeah, generally speaking, rabbis don't like Frankists. And also it's believed that was, at least according to Shifrei Abesht, the in praise of the Baal Shem Tov, which is a hagiographic kind of magical history of the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Chassidut, is that when the Besht saw the mass conversion of Frankists, he was so pained physically by it that he died, and that's how the Besht died. Okay, so anonymous attendee. I think I know this guy, but that's a joke. But he unfortunately had to step away for a minute, so I don't know if he spoke about this or not. My question is, my nafka mina. What is the practical difference? Or is there a lesson, my nafka mina, extended to our current situation? And the stability of the respective communities. You're gonna have to educate me on this one, actually, because I'm actually not sure what you're asking. If you can, All right. The modern rabbinate seems to be a very different place where, oh, seems to be in a different place where identity and participation as a community seem to much more emotional than it was then. Okay. Any prescription for the role of rabbis? Okay, I think I get your question. So first of all, I think that there's a misconception here. If I understand you correctly, I think what you're saying, and there's some truth, of course, to this, that like in the early modern period, rabbis actually have authority. But as we're going through the early modern period, the authority of rabbis is being eroded entirely. Like you said, you've got mysticism on one side that is eroding the authority of the rabbis. You have science and skepticism and ultimately Haskalah that's also eroding the authority of the rabbis. So I think that there's an erosion of rabbinic authority in the early modern period. But here's another thing at play, is that rabbis in the early modern period don't first of all, they undermine each other all the time, like in the Emden Ibis case, but also like in the boycott of Ancona in 1556. The rabbis, that boycott might have worked had the Italian rabbinate under Joshua Cincino kind of gone along with the plan to penalize the papal states for their execution of conversos, which the Ottomans were going to go along with, and had support from one of the greatest of all rabbis at the time, Samuel de Medina in Salonika. So, sometimes rabbis undermined these efforts and their inability to kind of come together. But the bigger issue here is that the rabbis are bought and sold by kehilot in Europe. So, rabbis don't have that much authority. Once they cross what the kehillah wants, then they can be fired. And this is a kind of case. So one of the arguments that's made about the early modern period by Elisheva Karlbach is that it's exactly the rabbis that don't have community posts that actually have the ability to shape rabbinics, that actually have the ability to speak their minds. So those that oppose Sabbatianism are really those that don't have a kehillah to answer to. So Yaakov Sesportis, nobody likes him as a rabbi in a community. So he ends up becoming he's an independent voice, but it allows him to really oppose Sabbatianism. Yaakov Emden, he can't get a job, even though he believes he's entitled to one because his father was Tzvi Hirsch Ashkenazi, who was a great community rabbi. But he doesn't have one. So, but it allows him to really speak up against Sabbatianism. So, the idea that rabbis have any real coercive power over what Jews do is kind of crazy. I mean, they have the cherem and they fight for the cherem. Ezekiel Orlando fights for the cherem because Moses Mendelssohn wants to get rid of it. But the cherem isn't really a power of the rabbis. The rabbis have the power to recommend the cherem to the parnasim, to the kehillah that can implement the cherem, which is a ban or an excommunication. So, rabbis don't have that much authority really in the early modern period. And if there's a prescription for today, I don't know. That's why I'm an historian. I look backwards, only backwards, never forwards. It's my motto. Okay, so we have Clyde. Evidence that the Maharal created a golem. I don't think so. Chava probably knows better. My understanding is that the golem is a book written by Yossel, or someone wrote Rosenberg. Yeah, Rosenberg. And it was written in like 1920 or something. So it was really responding more to a situation post-Russian Revolution. And I read those stories. They have them in English. I have them at home, and the story, they're kind of, to me, they read as a comedy. The golem is kind of an idiot who the rabbis tell him to do something, and he just takes it so literally. And then I think later on he's become the golem has become a more like darker kind of character than he originally conceived of. But I'm unaware of any like actual references to a golem in the Maharal. I mean, do you know? Huh?
No, there are some references, but that's not the point. The point, I think, is that because he was a Kabbalist, Maharal really knew Kabbalah, and Kabbalah in the early modern period is very much, it's very close to magic in a sense that words, especially letters, have power, have magical power. So it's the combination of the fact that he was he was open to modern science or to the science of his day. He was also a Kabbalist, but in a sense, he's creating something because of his knowledge. I think that's the only I don't think that there was such a thing as a golem, but I think that there is a legend about the power of the Maharal to create a golem. So it's really a cultural construct more than an entity. So that's why I would take issue with the question. So it's not whether he did or he didn't, but what people ascribe to him that he has done because of his knowledge.
That sounds good to me. There's been, but the golem has turned into such a great literary figure. It seems like every Jewish novel I read now has a golem in it, like the Cavalier and Clay, obviously. But I read this one written by a non-Jew, August, and it's called Snow in August, I think. It was a great book if you like baseball and stuff. It's like a New York Jewish story, and in the culmination, I don't want to give the book away, but it has a golem in it, and I'm like, boy, you can't get away from these golems. they're everywhere you turn. But I do feel like the golem has become a more treacherous kind of character than maybe originally intended. Just from my own reading, I haven't read the actual literary criticism of it, but it's an interesting question. Okay, so Jacob Cohen, the presentation is full of content and it's difficult to take notes. Yeah, so you'll get the recording. Yeah, that's Jacob, I completely take mea culpa for that. That's my fault. I'm like goose feeding you knowledge and information. I don't know if it's knowledge, but definitely information. And so, that's my fault about this. I'm just a little excited to talk about rabbis.
Yeah, but just to respond to Mr. Cohen, yes, all the lectures are available, and this one too will be available on the site of Jewish Studies. So if you missed the lecture, you can always go there and listen to it again. And
also, Mr. Cohen, if you write to me, my email is easy to find, just online. If you write to me, I'll send you a PDF of the PowerPoint, and then you could take it from there, and then you could follow up with other readings. Okay, so Nissan, so Shneur Lehman noted that the committee that censored the responsum of the Ramah about Stam Yenam was led by the Chacham Tzvi. Okay, I have to think about that for a second, because you mean some in a much later period, because the Chacham Tzvi is in the late 17th century and early 18th century. So you're saying that Tzvi Hirsch Ashkenazi censored a responsum about not drinking wine, Stam Yenam. Okay, so I'll take your word for that. But I will say I don't believe that the Ramah and the Chacham Tzvi are not contemporaries. Okay, I learned a great deal. So many thanks, Professor Mervis. Thank you. That was an easy one. Thank you for the softball. Okay, we've been getting a lot of really hard questions here. And an anonymous attendee again says, why does one have to register for the program after clicking join here? That might be one of the most profound questions we've had.
I would take into advisement.
I'll take that. We don't know, and we're working on Zoom to try to work out some of these glitches. And I apologize if you had any difficulty with the program.
Yeah, Zoom. I think it might have to do with something with ASU, because there's a lot of security features built into the ASU Zoom. subscription. So that probably is. So, and then Nissan says, Professor Lehman, are you talking about Sid Lehman at Brooklyn College?
Sid Lyman, it's Lyman, actually.
He's a great scholar, Professor Lyman has documented that the Golem was written as a novel by who gave us Duddy Kravitz. Okay, cool. And Jacob Cohen, if my name is on the thing, it's just my name at the asu.edu. But look, you can just put my name in Google and you can find my email very easily. It's stanley.mervis@asu.edu. So Sid Lyman. I should have picked that one up before. I didn't. I just haven't heard him, Schneer Lyman. But he's a great scholar of Emden Ibis, its controversy, and Sabbatianism. So I would take his word for it. Yeah.
So does that take care of all the questions? I believe so, right? So maybe by way of conclusion, can you hear me?
Yeah, I hear you. Oh, there's a whole bunch in the chat.
For some reason I cannot see you. Something is got out of. But anyway, maybe could you say a word just to connect us? Can you make a connection between Rabbinic Authority and the emergence of Hasidism with a different type of a rabbinic leader?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't pretend to know much about Hasidut. To me, Hasidut is like has always felt like a black hole in my understanding. Like somehow I hit a wall. That's how it feels when I try to understand it. I don't have like I feel deeply inadequate talking about Hasidim. I love to talk about the Haskalah. I can talk about the Haskalah all day, but Hasidim is something I can't claim to really understand that well. But to my understanding is that it's a very different construct of a rabbi, and that with Hasidim, with the Beshtian Hasidim, you really have more of a court culture than a kahila, and that's one of the reasons I think why the old school like Clayton Kabbalists like Landau or like Elijah Vilna really one of the reasons that they really opposed Hasidut was because it de-emphasized the kahila, and the kahila was the very basis of the power structure for the rabbinate. Right, a rabbi without a kahila is a barking dog. I mean that in a complimentary way. But a rabbi without a kahila doesn't have the real power to issue a cherem. Can only denounce people, but it can't actually has nothing behind him. And by the way, it's always a him, and I think that there's room for gender discourse in this too, as like talking about the kind of Jewish masculinity, just as a side note, embodied in the rabbinate. But I think with Beshti and Hasidim, instead of a kihila, you get this model of court culture where there is a level of dveikut, where there is kind of self erasure that's happening with the chassid in his joining with the divine through ecstatic prayer. But sometimes that dveikut could take the form of so dveikut losing oneself and joining with the immenseness of God could also take the form of joining in the spiritual power of a leader of a rabbinic of a Hasidic court with the Rabbi. So there is like, am I right to say that there can be a kind of almost like bodhisattva attachment between a chassid and the Rebbe, and by virtue of the Rebbe's merits, a chassid himself can be lifted towards a state of material erasure, where they're joining with the divine by virtue of the merits of the Rebbe. That's my understanding. That's a completely different. If that is the actual case, and I don't think to understand it well, but then. That's a very different model of rabbinics than what we're seeing here. All right, rabbis. I wouldn't say, you could say it maybe like this. Maybe it's overstating it, but it seems to me for Hasidim, the Rebbe serves a spiritual function, but the rabbinate in the early modern period in the Middle Ages wasn't a spiritual function as much as it was a legal function, a social function, a political function. And I don't think the rabbis are involved in elevating anyone's immortal soul or anything like that. So, I mean, that might be just to put out a bold statement to be accepted or rejected. I think that could be a key difference here.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that the bottom line is the difference between charismatic leadership, which what Hasidism is about, and a non-charismatic, which is what you've talked about.
Yeah, that's
So what's at stake is charisma, really.
Yeah, and not that there are uncharismatic rabbinic leaders. Surely the Maharal was a person of great charisma, but possibly, but Elijah of Vilna was definitely not, right? Someone who was noted as being a kind of recluse even. Emden, definitely not a charismatic leader. But I think that they're, and also like someone like Charles Mortier in Amsterdam, it's actually hard to understand where he's coming from. He at times almost seems unsympathetic to what conversos are going through. So you have those of the Portuguese world who are cultivating an interest in mysticism in order to understand their experiences, their trauma of having been conversos. So someone like Yitzhak Abu Abde Fonseca, who is translating the works of Kabbalists from the medieval Spain, and really talking about like things like the immortality of the soul and eternality of punishment, and then this Ashkenazi student of Leone Modena in Italy, like shuts it all down and says there is eternal punishment for conversos that are still living, your kinsmen living in Iberia, because they're not leaving like you did, will be damned forever. And it just shows a kind of like severe lack of connectedness to what his community was going through and their own traumas. So yeah, that seems to me very uncharismatic leadership. But I think by charismatic leadership, like the Rebbe in the Hasidic court was a pilgrimage site. Like Solomon Maimon describes in his autobiography, right? He like made a pilgrimage to go see the Dov Ber, the Maggid of Mezerich, because it was a pilgrimage to make, and there he, Solomon Maimon refers to the kind of amazement that he has at seeing Dov Ber, the Maggid of Mezerich, like how he amazed his followers with these intellectual feats. Like he would tell everybody to come up with a Torah, with a Torah sentence from, and then he would string all these random Torah quotations together and like be able to make these genius kind of sermons. And they were noted for their charisma and almost magical abilities. So yeah, that's a big difference, I think, in someone like Charles Mortier, who wasn't even nice, let alone magical. But I will say, Solomon Maimon certainly, Solomon Maimon at the end has lots of negative things to say about Hasidim. He basically sees them as being exploitive and without any substance, and so he rejects it completely. So even someone who is that adamantly against Hasidut, like Solomon Maimon, could be open about how captivated he was to visit Dov Ber, the Maggid of Mezerich, to see him in action.
Yes, that's an excellent answer. Detailed and insightful. So we're going to thank Professor Mervis for this wonderful lecture series, and that just to show us how much knowledge there is available here among the faculty of ASU professors, but also invite you all to continue to study and engage the richness of Jewish history. So I hope to see many of you on Tuesday, February 8th, in the second installment of the lecture series on ancient Judaism. And early Christianity.
And also,
So-
Chava, if you don't mind, I'm sorry to butt in. I just want to apologize to those of you who if I didn't read your question correctly or answer it in full. And I'm sure that happened as a product of the Zoom, so I apologize for that.
You did very well, don't worry. So thank you all and good night.